Chester, the home of a legion. This program examines the life of Roman Chester and what the Romans left behind.
Chester comes from a Saxon word, castor, which just means a Roman fort. So when the Saxon invaders came to this country and settled here, any Roman fortification, or indeed city, because they didn't make a distinction, they would call something or other castor. However, the name for Chester is peculiar because it changed, and it changed somewhere around the time of the Norman conquest in 1066. Before that time, it was actually called Legicaster, and the name was actually probably pronounced Leicester. And Legicaster means the castle of the legions, and that is still its name in Welsh now, Cae Legion. But sometime after the Norman conquest, they dropped the legi off the start of the word and just became Castor or Chester.
Chester was important because it was a large fortress settlement, the largest fortress settlement. In that sense, it wasn't really a city, it was a fortress, it was a military camp. It did have outside it a cannaby, an extramural settlement, which in effect, I guess, was a bit like a town outside a walled fortress. And that grew up with merchants, with the soldiers come on, their families, and basically people who wanted to try and service the legion that was staying here.
Well, Roman life in Chester, when the 20th Legion, my legion, gets here, would have been military. Chester, as the Romans knew it, is a tongue of sandstone with the River Dee passing on two sides. Military life with a small civilian outpost on the outside of it, clinging to it, because after all, if you've got 6,000 soldiers being paid 220 denarii a year, well, then you've got people who need to spend their money. So you have a small civilian quarter and they're essentially essential to the soldiers, which means everything from socks to underwear to prostitution to beer to wine, etc.
Chester was a military fortress, and it was the home of a legion. The legion was the crack troops in the Roman army, and there were only 26 legions in the whole of the Roman Empire, just 3 of them in Britain and 1 of them here in Chester, so that meant Chester was a very important place in Roman time. There are various theories about why the Romans came to Chester. Let's look at it 2 ways. There's the local conditions and then there's the bigger picture. Locally, it's the lowest point at which you could cross the River Dee, and there's a natural routeway which leads across from the Pennines, the Manchester area, across to where Chester is now, and then across into North Wales. And the sort of nature of the rocks and so on, and the route of the River Dee forces you to come this way. So that's what made it important in a local sense. But what the bigger picture was for the Romans is something that we're still discussing today, and perhaps archaeology will have the answer. My own particular idea is when they came here, they were intending to conquer Ireland, and that it was intended to be a base for Ireland, which it was in the medieval period. Chester in the medieval period was the place from which the English armies went across to conquer Ireland. My personal hunch is that that's what the Romans were thinking of as well. Now we know they never did it, but in the way that happened with the Romans, they, having put a base here, they never got to move it, it stayed and sort of became fossilised and turned to stone.
The walled city part of it is because it was a fortress, but I think what's fantastic about Chester is the fact that not only did the Romans have the walls, and in fact I have read and talked to archaeologists about this who've said that Chester was never designed to be attacked, even though it had its walls and it was a fortress. It was a symbol of Roman might and Roman power. Having said that, there's no doubt that through succeeding periods of Chester's history, the wall was used and strengthened, and the walls were extended in the Middle Ages, for example, to act as defensive features. And in Georgian times, when the threat of aggression, I guess, was minimised, then the walls were used as a promenade for what was a very fashionable city of the time. So the walls have had a role all the way through the development of Chester, one way and another, and it's that continuity which I think makes Chester a bit special.
Chester, like all sort of true Roman centres, whether they're military or civilian, has got an amphitheatre. And I think the debate still goes on about why you have to have an amphitheatre. We know that they were used for public executions, We know that they were used for sort of imitation wild beast hunts, where wild animals would be hunted in the arena by trained huntsmen. And you can perhaps see a shadow of this in the bullfights which we still have in Spain and southern France today. So those are called Wenationes, which means the hunts. The bit that we all remember, of course, particularly since Russell Crowe and Gladiator, is the gladiators, the people who fought to the death. There's a lot of romance about this. How much is true, we don't know. I mean, for example, the popular myth is that if you're a gladiator, you went out there and you killed, or you were killed yourself. As far as we know, in reality, this didn't happen except very rarely, and it seems to be commented on by the ancient authors if people were being killed like that in the arena. If you want to think of it in these terms, it's like an extreme form of the extreme wrestling which goes on in the United States today. And we're not supposed to talk about this in our cultured society, but people do like people being hurt and watching it. You've only got to watch the TV show about the celebrities in the jungle, which has just started, to know this. If you see somebody getting bitten and in pain, everybody thinks this is a hoot. So I don't think we should be too precious about our values. There would be gladiator fights probably in the arena at Chester, but how many is difficult to say. Gladiator shows, by definition, were very expensive to put on. Because gladiators were well trained, they were well fed, in many ways they were pampered, if you like to call it that. All this cost money. So the people who ran the gladiator shows, and this was organised like a sort of franchise, if you like, were quite expensive. So somebody who's going to put on a gladiator show had to have a lot of money. And why would you spend that money? What was the point? In the bigger cities in the Roman Empire, we know it was to do with politics, that people would put on a gladiator show to impress the populace so that they would vote for them. In Chester, which is a civilian place, a military place, that doesn't apply because the commander of the legion was the commander and nobody could unelect him, shall we say. So it's difficult to see why or how a proper gladiator show would have been put on at Chester, because the mechanism for it being created probably didn't exist.
The amphitheatre here, we're in the middle of a 3-year programme of investigation and exploration and further excavation to decide on the future role. So we are in the process of finding out more about it. What we think we've found out so far, we used to think there was a timber amphitheatre followed by a stone one. We now think that there was a small stone one followed later on by a larger one into which the first one was incorporated.
Here in Chester we know that the troops in the army came from all over the empire. We've got people here who came from Turkey, would you believe, and from Syria, from Egypt, as well as more local places to us anyway, shall we say Spain and Italy. There were very, very few Italians here. Most of them came from other parts of the Roman Empire. So it was a very cosmopolitan society. At the same time, it was held together by, well, it probably would be just a veneer of classical civilization, but it would also be held together by the Latin language, because that would be the common language that everyone would have to know so that they could deal with each other. As far as we have an insight into what people were like who lived in Chester, we've got a very, very important collection of Roman tombstones here, which sounds a fairly dreary subject, but in fact we have so many of them that it gives us a real insight into what sort of people lived here in Roman times. We know from their names, for example, that quite a lot of them came from the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So although we call it the Roman Empire, a lot of the people actually had Greek names. Anybody who came here from Greece or Turkey walked here. The other side of the coin, of course, if they'd come here all that way, they couldn't go back. But a lot of people made a life here, women and children as well as the soldiers I've talked about earlier, so it was a very cosmopolitan place.
That was life in Roman Chester, but what happened after the Roman Empire collapsed?
The end of Roman Chester is a $64,000 question, as the end of all the Roman settlements in Britain is. There's a myth which is still told today that the Romans left Britain or the Romans went home or something like that. This isn't what happened at all. Basically what happened around about the year 400 is that the whole Roman system broke down, and this affected Britain and the rest of Western Europe in the space of about 50 years. In Britain, it happened somewhere between 400 and 420 AD. In very simple terms, the Roman mints stopped delivering money, so there was no money to go around anymore. And also, because the Roman authority in Central Europe had collapsed, there were no governors or officials coming over anymore to organise the state. So I think it's easy to imagine a situation where, say, the governor of Britain had returned to the continent after his 3-year term or whatever it was, and all the officials and the petty bureaucrats waited for the next one to come, but he never came. So of course what would happen? Because nobody would be an authority, and everyone would say, well, I'm not accepting what you're telling me, and so you would end up in a discord, to put it mildly, if not indeed a civil war, and the whole system would break down. And of course, if there was no money, there was no way of paying officials, there was no way of paying troops. So the whole structure of society, both as a civilian society and the defence, the army, would all break down, and the whole civilization would have collapsed. And we believe in Britain it happened within about 20 years, which is a fairly sobering thought for what might happen to our society if something went wrong.